Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here at the Heritage Foundation in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. Would ask everyone in-house to make that final courtesy check that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. Always helpful when the panelist does that, too. Our program will be posted on the Heritage homepage following the event for your future reference. And of course, our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Co-hosting the event on behalf of Heritage today is Dr. James J. Carafano. He is our E.W. Richardson Fellow and also Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies. He is an accomplished historian, teacher, and leading expert on defense and homeland security policy. He serves as a senior fellow at George Washington University's Homeland Security Policy Institute, on the Board of Trustees of the Marine Corps University Foundation, and several advisory boards. He's also served as a visiting professor at the National Defense University and Georgetown. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Jim Carafano. Jim?
Well, thank you, and welcome to Heritage, and thank you for coming for, I think, which is a really exciting discussion. We actually all got here a bit early, so we're in the room together, which we hardly ever do, because we're always kind of running from event to event. So we were all in the room saying, "Gee, isn't it? We don't get enough to do this," and hopefully we're going to continue that spirit through here. So I'm just going to briefly kind of run over the framework, and then we'll get started. I'm not a big fan of debates, and maybe we brought you here under false advertising, because the debate's about winners and losers. But the one thing I can tell you about our panel is everyone in this panel is interested in only one thing, which is having America be as free, safe, and secure and prosperous as possible. And they all share that common love, which is why we love having them here. And I'm much more interested in this being more of a discussion and an exchange of idea than scoring points. And I'm very excited that I think everybody on the panel feels the same way. So a really unique opportunity for us to get four people this knowledgeable, this distinguished in one place at one time. I'm really excited to get at it. Andy and I are going to co-host the thing, so I'm going to introduce Andy very, very briefly. He's going to come up and make some introductory remarks, introduce our panel, and then we are going to tag team, just throwing out some general questions to the panel to kind of stimulate the discussion. And then partway through that, because we have 87 minutes to go, partway through that we're going to bring in the audience and allow you folks to ask discussions as well, and we hope you will. So when we get to the face, think about what your questions are going to be, and if you would raise your hand, and we have microphones, and if you would wait for the microphone, that would be really helpful, because then folks who are listening online, and we archive these things, so people will go back and read these things. They get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and they have nothing better to do. So and also, if you would just state your name and affiliation when you ask a question, that'd be great. So we will get to you guys. We have plenty of time for this discussion, so please don't feel that you're going to be left out. Oh, it's only an hour? I lied. Sorry. What do I know? Thank you for correcting me. We are very honored to co-host this event with National Review, and Andy McCarthy is a very distinguished scholar and powerful voice on a whole range of national security and foreign policy issues, and he is with the National Review, and so I'm really honored to kind of co-host this with. So let me turn the podium over to Andy to introduce our panel, and then we'll get right into it. So.
Well, thanks so much, Jim. Scholar, I feel like I got a field promotion there. It's a great thrill for us to be here on behalf of National Review to partner with Heritage on this discussion, which I think will be very illuminating. National security is the first responsibility of the federal government, and while it's not the only responsibility of the government, to my mind, if it were the only thing on account of which Washington taxed and spent, that would be significantly better than what we have now. Furthermore, as Hamilton observed, we'll never be able to anticipate every conceivable threat to national security, and thus the wherewithal to defend the nation cannot be prudently constrained. The maxim of peace through strength teaches that the best defense is one so imposing that it rarely has to be used. But that costs money, and how much is enough in an age of $17 trillion budgets with a trajectory toward $22 trillion in short order? To probe those questions and other related ones, we've assembled a really fabulous panel today. Danielle Pletka is Vice President of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Senator Jim Talent, for whom national security policy has always been a central focus, is now a distinguished fellow here at Heritage. Mark Jacobson is a senior advisor to the Truman National Security Project and a senior transatlantic fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And Lawrence Korb, a former naval flight officer and assistant secretary of defense, is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. So without further ado, let me suggest some opening remarks by Danielle. Do you want to begin?
I'm going to give the mic to.
She's yielding to me.
Very
I
well.
know.
It's okay.
Distinguished colleague.
I kind of liked it when you were calling this the high noon debate because I'm an old movie fan, and I figured we all knew you'd be Grace Kelly,
I'm
right?
definitely going to be Grace Kelly.
I would say which of us is Gary Cooper and which of us is Lon Chaney Jr. I'll leave the audience to.
There'll be a vote at the end.
Okay, we all have a few minutes here, and I think that's good, so we have a chance to, present what we think are the key points in this area. And it's a little bit ironic that we're doing a discussion of defense policy here, because really for the last 2 years, Washington hasn't been making defense policy. I mean, defense policy is when you figure out what interests you're trying to protect in the world, what the threats are to those interests, what capabilities you need to defend against those threats, and then what kind of a plan you need to develop those capabilities and sustain them over time. And that isn't what they've been doing. They've been plugging numbers into different budgetary scenarios that are designed to produce different deficit projections at different points in a grid. Deficit projections, which, by the way, are usually arbitrary, at any rate, unreal. I mean, the one thing we know about Washington deficit projections is that they don't come true. And that's what's been substituting for defense policy. It's no accident that our power is declining as a result of that relative to the risks that we confront. Let me just go back. I think to figure out where we are now, you got to look to some extent at where we've been in the past. So let's go back 20 years ago. Cold War ends. The United States government, both Bush 1 and the Clinton administration, cut the force pretty much across the board by 35 to 40%, all three of the services. There were two assumptions that were operative at the time. One of them is that the world would be relatively peaceful for a relatively long period of time, so we wouldn't need to use the military as much. And second, that in any event, they would modernize the force. In other words, they would buy the best equipment, the highest technology, so each service member would be more lethal and less vulnerable, and therefore we wouldn't need as many of them. Those were the two operative assumptions. Well, it turned out the world wasn't all that peaceable. I mean, we picked up the operation in Kosovo, the Iranian nuclear program, first the Korean nuclear program, then a little set of missions called the Global War on Terror, whatever they call it, that was kind of big, superimposed on that force. China surged their power. Eventually we got the Arab Spring, Al-Qaeda metastasizing different parts of the world. None of this was foreseen at the time these decisions were made, and they didn't modernize either. I mean, forget about buying technologically new equipment. They didn't procure the programs they had. They went on what was explicitly called, I was there at the time, a procurement holiday. Basically stopped buying equipment for the military. Well, what happens when you do that? What would happen to UPS if they stepped up their activities at the same time as they stopped buying trucks? I mean, you end up with a force that is stressed, with equipment that is increasingly out of date and just doesn't work. And that's what actually Barack Obama inherited. But when he started his presidency, the Navy was the smallest it had been since 1917. The Air Force, the smallest, with the oldest inventory it had since the inception of the service. The Army was stressed. I mean, Bob Gates was giving speeches at the time. And what have they done since then? Well, Secretary Gates took $300 billion out of the next 10 years of defense budgets, cut most of the remaining, or many of the remaining modernization programs. Then the spring of 2011, another $500 billion taken out of the next 10 years, with no analysis, conceitedly at that point, with no military analysis or justification, just took it out. And then the sequester of another $500 million, and they did an analysis then. They said it would be devastating, like shooting ourselves in the head, and it has been. They're eating into day-to-day readiness. The Army's curtailed training by 80%. This is the testimony of the chiefs. The Navy, 2/3 of the fleet's not going to be ready for major operations. The Air Force has ceased ops for 1/3 of its fighters and bombers. Okay, look, I don't want to filibuster. But let me go to conclude. 3 years ago, Congress, and they do this periodically, created a commission of graybeards chaired by Bill Perry, the former Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, and Steve Hadley, who was the National Security Advisor under George Bush. 20 people from across the political spectrum, all very distinguished, except for me. I served on it also. We studied the plans of the Department. That was our explicit task, to study the plans of the Department of Defense. Everything I've said to this point, the Perry-Hadley Commission unanimously said in its report. And their conclusion was, look, you got, at a minimum, you got to build up the size of the Navy, and you got to recapitalize the inventories of the services. And you need to do that by eliminating waste, and you're going to have to add funding. And they said, if you don't do those things, a train wreck is coming, explicitly, for America's military. Well, they didn't. They went in the opposite direction. And I would suggest to you the train wreck is here. And the thing I tell people, I testified for the House Budget Committee a couple of years ago, okay, admit there's a problem. Washington needs to admit even if you're not prepared to spend a lot more money, admit there's a problem so you can begin to focus energy on how you solve it. Thank you, moderator.
Sure. I would first like to thank National Review and Heritage for having me here today in such a distinguished group. I'm really just pleased to get the chance not only to speak to you a little bit and to, I guess, debate light a bit, but also to learn. So let me start with agreeing with Senator Talent on two issues. Yes, we have to figure out who will play whom in the movie. I'll pick Van Johnson, but that may go over the head of most
Van
folks here.
Johnson was not in High Noon, my friend.
No, but Van Johnson was in some of my favorite.
Oh, I see.
My favorite good movies. So, exactly. The second piece is, on a serious note, I do think it's important to understand that the executive branch alone cannot solve the problems of national defense and national security. There must be a partnership, not only with the legislative branch, but with the private sector, with industry, and of course with our allies. And I'm not saying that to take a pass on what the executive branch needs to do. I just think it's the realization that no matter what changes, no matter what adjustments take place in the executive branch, it may not get us to where we need to be. When President Truman took office, he of course was faced with finishing, in some ways, two wars, wrapping up things in the European theater, and still several bloody months away from the end of the war in the Pacific. He also had to deal with a time where there were emerging threats, new ideological threats, not fascism but communism. And of course, he had to do with changes at home, the potential for tremendous economic changes. There were already demographic and cultural shifts taking place at home. And then he had an unprecedented technological revolution, actually several revolutions to deal with in terms of military technology. Most importantly, of course, the maturity of the air power revolution, and then one that has shaped our lives, of course, the nuclear revolution. I say that just to give a sense that I don't believe that any president since Truman has had to deal with as many challenges that don't just impact the surface, but the fundamental nature of the national security threats until the presidencies, to be fair, both of Bush and certainly of President Obama. So with that context, I want to talk about the uncertainty that is faced, that the administration faces, and how I think at the broadest levels the administration needs to deal with it, and how we need to think about our national defense and overall national security posture. I don't believe that the Hamiltonian premise holds. I don't believe that you can simply arm yourself to be the strongest power in terms of kinetic military force, and this alone guarantees safety. The world is a much smaller place. There are no boundaries in many ways, and I don't just speak about the world of cyber and the internet. I'm also talking about the exchange of ideas, the ability of weapons to reach literally across the globe. And in our lifetimes, it won't take hours, in our lifetimes, it doesn't just take hours, it takes minutes for some countries to strike out across the globe. And it won't just always be the advantage of our nation. I also think that as Americans, we've often tried to substitute technology for manpower. Understandably, the lives of our men and women in uniform, the blood and treasure it is indescribable the loss that families have to feel when thousands have not come home, when tens of thousands of others have come home wounded, grievously in some cases. So that's understandable. But at the same time, I think we must understand that in developing the national security budgets and developing the defense budget, we must not simply think about things. We must think about people. This goes beyond changing compensation systems to adjust for the reality of the professional military today. It is just as important to have those members who spend 10 years on active duty and then leave, or 10 years on active duty, shift into the reserve, as it is to have the 20-year career veteran. Likewise, I agree with the Senator in terms of one aspect of what he said in terms of a holiday. But I think the holiday has been taken, frankly, for 100 years in terms of U.S. military personnel systems. They do not assist with the ability to create an adaptable force that can shift and change not only in status from active to reserve and back and forth, but in terms of career paths, in terms of allowing our military, our men and women in uniform to shift to new areas that may be more important than in the past. We've seen this over the last 10 years where we got rid of air defense, and now we're focusing on military police and on special operations forces. We're trying to create a cyber cadre, which the skill sets needed there are not necessarily the same warrior skill sets that are needed for infantry. But again, we must have a system that promotes the ability of our men and women in uniform to become dynamic in terms of their understanding of foreign cultures and operating out of area. Let me shift a little bit too to wrap up. I also think that we have to understand that the strength of our nation is not simply in how capable and competent the Department of Defense is. The way wars are waged today means that the U.S. Agency for International Development is often on the front lines before any uniformed member sets foot in a country. We still need to focus on trying to develop a national security budget. I spoke about the legislative branch. I think that we need to be able to plan a bit further. Two-year budget cycles. Stop making the department run, 3 or 4 budgets at the same time? That can help promote the type of adaptability, and then again, with proper congressional oversight, or even, I would say, robust congressional oversight, force the department to live up to the standards that are required. There's nothing wrong with continued oversight, but I do think the department needs much more flexibility. I'm sure we'll get to that a bit in terms of discussing sequestration. Finally, one of my former bosses, General Stanley McChrystal, I think aptly stated to the world that he wasn't as concerned about Iran or terrorism as he was about the inability of our nation's children to have the type of education that will enable them to face a complex world. Education is a national security issue. I think that's something that people who've studied the history of our nation understand. You have to have an educated public. You have to have an educated citizenry to provide the types of men and women in uniform we'll need for the future. With that, I'll leave it, and I'm sure we'll get back to some of those later.
Oh, Danielle doesn't go? She seated her,
Ladies last.
okay. Let me start off by making 2 points. No matter how much you spend on defense, you can't buy perfect security. And I think that's very, very important. And the other is you can't anticipate the future. And I was reminded of this. I was in Israel recently, and as you may know, they're cutting back their defense spending. And somebody told me this story about an elderly couple before they went to meet their maker, decided they wanted to go to the Holy Land. So they got over there, and unfortunately, the man passed away. So the rabbi came to the woman and said, "I'm very sorry for your loss. You have a decision to make." She said, "Well, what's that?" He said, "Do you want to have him buried here, or do you want to take him home?" And she said, "Well, how much would it cost to have him buried here?" The rabbi said, "I don't know, $50, $100. She said, "What happens if I take him home?" He said, "Well, that'll be several $1,000s." So she thought for a couple of seconds, and she said, "I want to take him home." The rabbi said, "Doesn't make any sense. 50, 100, 5,000. She said, "Well, I heard that years ago they buried a fella here. and after 3 days, he rose again, and I don't want to take a chance. And that's the thing, I mean, you say, it's impossible to pick the future. So when you take a look at that, I think then you can put what we're doing in defense, into context. Now, I see a lot about defense in an age of austerity. The country's in an age of austerity, but the Defense Department is not, okay? If you take a look, even under sequestration, now we all agree the process of doing it is dumb, where you have to cut everything. But even if you take the amount for sequestration, okay, it's $475 billion, all right? If you go back and you look at what we spent, even controlling for inflation, on average during the Cold War, that's more, okay? It's more than we spent on average in the 1980s. Yes, Reagan had a big defense buildup for the first 4 years, but then we had a deficit problem, and we cut defense spending by 10% over the next 4 years. And then, as the senator mentioned, when President Bush came in, even before the end of the Cold War, he started cutting defense. In fact, I talked to John Sununu, who was the chief of staff to the first President Bush, and he said when Dick Cheney was put over in the Defense Department, this is 1989, the Cold War hasn't ended, first thing they told him is you got to cut $30 billion because we're worried about the deficit. The next thing to keep in mind is the defense budget until 2010, and it's been level since then, went up for 13 straight years in real terms. Again, that's never happened. Reagan, it was 4. And then, it was over. So it basically has gone up. Now, the next thing to keep in mind is, yes, there are threats out there. There always are. We do not have an existential threat like the Soviet Union, okay? When people say, oh, you got to worry about Iran, you got to worry about North Korea, the Soviet Union had tens of thousands, maybe 30, 40,000 nuclear weapons. They had a fleet over 1,000 ships. They had 5,000 or 6,000 tanks, okay? So when you talk about, yes, it's, there are things that you can use the military for, but we don't face an existential threat. Now, I have to laugh. A lot of people say, well, look at the percentage of GDP that we spend on defense. It's lower than the Cold War, no doubt about it. And look at the Chinese threat. What percentage of the GDP is China spending on their defense? 1.3%, okay? We're about 4. We're probably going down to 3. And this gets to the points that Mark was making in terms of the other things that you're concerned about, because you can't be strong abroad if you're not strong at home. Now the next thing, and the senator mentioned something. Look at all the cuts we've had. Wait a second. The part of the Budget Control Act in the summer of 2011 said cut $480 billion off of projected increases. It was not a cut. In fact, if you take a look at that, the budget leveled off and then it would keep pace with inflation. I mean, if you use that logic, again, when I worked for President Reagan, my boss, Cap Weinberger, wanted the budget to continue to go up at 5% a year in real terms. So that would have been a 20% increase in the next 4 years. It goes down 10. That wasn't a 30% cut. It was a 10% cut. With what we're talking about, even if you do sequestration, that's only a 7% real cut over the next 10 years. We did 10%, in 4 years. Now, if you take a look at what's happening in the world, in 2001, we had 1/3 of the world's military expenditures, 1/3 of the world's economy. Now we're 40%. 40%, even with sequestration, and we have 19% of the world's economy. So when you take a look at that, now I would argue, does the Defense Department have problems? Yes, they have terrible problems, and I'll tell you what they are. They're management problems. Obviously, I have my concerns about Vice President Cheney, but let me tell you, he was a hell of a Secretary of Defense, and you know why? Because they got him a strong deputy, Don Atwood, who came from General Motors. If you go back and you take a look at when we've had less money, like in the Nixon administration, when today's budget in the Nixon administration, we had about $340 billion, even controlling for inflation. Who was the deputy? David Packard. And I remember when I was at AEI, which people are surprised, and one of my mentors there was Mel Laird. And he became Secretary of Defense. I said, what were you thinking? He said, I never managed anything that big. I asked Bill Baruti, who was the president of who's the best manager in the country? And they said, David Packard. So I went out and hired him. Okay? When Jimmy Carter appointed Harold Brown to be Secretary of Defense, he had picked his deputy, Charlie Duncan from Coca-Cola, okay? Unless you have that, you're not going to, be able to get more bang for the buck. Let me conclude by reading this to you. Then I'll ask you who said this. But here, too, we have to acknowledge an inconvenient fact. Sequestration has occurred because of a growing public frustration with the culture of waste and inefficiency at the Defense Department when addressed for too long. I have witnessed the emergence of a military industrial congressional complex that has corrupted and crippled the defense acquisition process. The system can now be said to be successful only in one respect, turning billions of taxpayer dollars into weapon systems that are consistently delivered late, flawed, and vastly over budget, if, that is, these systems are delivered at all. For example, there was the Expeditionary Combat Support System, which the Air Force had to cancel last year after wasting roughly $1 billion and receiving no combat capability. The Littoral Combat Ship already cost twice as much per ship as planned. A recent study found that from 2004 to 2010, canceled programs consumed an average of 45% of the Army's annual budget for development, testing, and engineering. The Joint Strike Fighter, which will become the first trillion-dollar weapon system in history, is being purchased before being tested, which drives up costs enormously, and the system is still not fully proven. John McCain. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to go last. Until Larry spoke, I thought I was going to have to be all nice and polite about the fact that we all agree with each other. And I think there are some core truths that we all do agree about. And that's actually important, even when we have the premise of a debate in front of us. Nonetheless, I think that we all do agree about certain key issues. We all agree, for example, that there are reforms necessary within the Pentagon. We all agree, as Mark very nicely said, that that technology is no substitute for manpower. These are all sort of great eternal truths. I think that even more importantly, perhaps, I think you said something that I couldn't agree with more and that perhaps isn't said often enough, particularly among conservatives, and that is that the Department of Defense is not the anchor of a national security strategy. It is part of a national security strategy. But if you don't have a decent State Department, if you don't have a National Security Council that functions, if you have a Congress that is uninterested or disinterested, then obviously you're going to have a real challenge. And you can't simply substitute strength for strategy. And I think we all agree about that. And I think we all also agree about another issue that, interestingly enough, you'll find plenty of people in Washington, increasing numbers of people in Washington, who disagree with all of us. And that is the importance of America being in the world. That is the importance of us actually engaging internationally, the importance of not retreating, no matter what we think about the F-35, just to pick a question that's been on the headlines lately. No matter what we think about that, I think all of us believe that the United States has a very important role to play. Okay? Now, I don't want to talk defense numbers in large part because I'll sound like an idiot, but secondarily
You never
because...
sound like an idiot.
Well, ask my family, but because Jim will do a much better job on the point by point. I think that the top line question, just to use the budgetary language, the top line question has to be, what do we want to achieve? It isn't what do we want to spend. And that's really part of the problem that Jim laid out at the beginning, which is that whether you think the sequester is a good thing, as Larry does, or you think that the sequester is a bad thing, as I do, as we do, you have to understand that the best way to cut money, if you're going to cut money, is not to take a meat axe to a budget and whack it. Okay? I think Mark is absolutely right. If you have a budget year to year to year, people plan badly. You can't plan. You know, if I say to you, well, you could buy a house this year, okay, but next year, I'm not going to promise you that you're going to have enough money to pay your mortgage. I'll guarantee paying your salary this year, but afterwards, maybe, maybe not. Let me tell you, first, the bank's not going to give you a mortgage. Second of all, you're not going to buy that house. And that is the position that Pentagon after Pentagon has found itself in, and I couldn't agree more. I think that it is a capricious budgetary process. Look at this, that the President of the United States has come out and told us that the sequester is a disaster. It's a terrible thing. It's a shot, not a shot in the foot, it's a shot in the head. Okay, and then he sends a budget up to the Congress that doesn't include the sequester in it. I'm sorry, what? You tell us it's a terrible thing and then pretend it doesn't exist? How are we supposed to act in the real world when that happens? So this is a dysfunction problem, and it's a bipartisan dysfunction problem. Couldn't agree more about that. On the other hand, I think that the question we have to ask is, Larry laid out a whole series of numbers. No matter what you believe, whether we're spending too much or too little, we need to understand that it is not about whether you wish to spend $1 or $2 or $2 billion on a particular issue. It is what you seek to achieve with that dollar. Okay? Once you lay out that national security strategy, then you start to answer the question about what the requirements are to achieve it. Okay? At that moment, we need to recognize we have a very serious problem, because you can talk about comparisons with the Truman administration or any other administration. You need to understand that we're going to be spending 50% of the Pentagon budget on personnel, on TRICARE, on what is essentially a welfare state. Okay? Now, that may be the compact that we've made with the men and women of the military, but we need to understand that fully 50% of it is not going to be going towards what we think of as the goals of the national defense. It's going to be going to folks who fought before, people who needed money before, people who were promised things before, the unbelievable exploding costs of health care for the men and women, not just in uniform, by the way, but also the civilians in the Pentagon. So these are all really, really important questions. I think that there are a couple of other particular issues that I just want to highlight for us to understand. Okay, number one, do we have an enemy like the Soviets? No, we don't have an enemy like the Soviets. What are we willing to tolerate? Okay? What are we willing to accept? You want Iran to have a nuclear weapon? Fine. We don't need to have troops. We don't need to have a sufficient navy in the Mediterranean. You want China to dominate the Pacific? No problem. We don't need to serve our allies in the Pacific. We don't need to do those things. You merely have to ask what it is you're willing to tolerate. But by the way, not just those big things out there. Do we want free trade? Do we support free trade? Do we want to guarantee free trade? Do you still want to buy the things at the price that you buy them at now? Because what we've done in the world and the position we've taken has sought to guarantee that for the last 60 years. Do we want to continue? If we don't, then let's stop right now. Last point, okay, and that is one that is, I find particularly dishonest. Sorry, Larry. Let us not make invidious comparisons with the Chinese, okay? If we paid our soldiers what the Chinese pay their soldiers, if we paid for defense contractors what the Chinese pay their PLA-owned defense contractors, I can assure you that our defense budget would also be 1.3%. In fact, it would probably be 0.3%. Okay? So it's an apples to oranges comparison. And I think if we look at the Chinese buildup, and particularly the exponential growth of the Chinese buildup in relation to the size of their economy, we have a lot to worry about. It's not a 4-to-1 issue.
So, thank you so much for filling in charter. It's a great range of discussion and issues, and I know you'd love to jump back and forth with each other, but there are some things that Andy and I really want to get on the table. So what we're going to try to do is maybe do like 4 lightning rounds. I'll ask a question, Andy, me, Andy, and then we try to get to the Q&A from the audience. And I'd like to offer the whole panel the opportunity to answer these questions. But I'd like to get into some issues to make sure that we really do cover the breadth of everything. So the first one is normally the one that comes up last, which is where are we going in terms of the future in terms of missile defense and nuclear issues? Like, it gets to be a hot button question when we worry about North Korea for a few days or Iran, but as soon as they're out of the news, we don't talk about them anymore. So the nuclear arsenal, the triad, modernization, missile defense, if we could just each briefly kind of summarize where you are in that would be great. And Larry, you want to start and we'll just run down the road?
Okay. Well, I think if you take a look at nuclear weapons, you can look at General Cartwright, who was the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Bush, Obama era, and he was also the only Marine to head the Strategic Command. He says we could get by with about 800 nuclear weapons, 400 deployed and 400 in reserve. And I think it makes sense to move in that direction, because if you don't, even regardless of how much money the budget is, you're going to have to spend an awful lot on modernizing all three legs of the triad. I think you ought to keep the triad. I think you can cut the number of weapons, and you wouldn't have to build as many new, submarines that the Navy wants to do as the Tridents are. So I do think you could do that. I think in terms of missile defense, some of the programs are good, but some, if you take a look at it, the real question is, will you ever be able to have it where it becomes national missile defense as opposed to theater missile defense? And I really have some doubts about that based upon my own experience when we started this program and talking to people like Dick Garwin, who Edward Teller said was responsible for, the hydrogen bomb. He said, you'll never be able to master it because of the problems of decoy. So I would emphasize, theater defense, which I think we do very well, and I would cut nuclear weapons. Now, everybody says, well, you can't do them without the Russians. No, the first Bush did. He got rid of the tactical nuclear weapons on the ships without, any agreement with the Russians.
And let me just make a quick comment on nuclear weapons. I don't think that you need to entirely look at numbers in terms of what's an effective deterrent. I'm more concerned about reliability. I think that's really, if the administration is going to use some political clout, that's a place to do it. I also think that in terms of the missile defense, the evolution of missile defense, there was a lot of noise made last year about the United States maybe not being there for its NATO allies, for the Poles, the Czechs. I think that's a misinterpretation of what happened. I think the administration has found a pathway that NATO can agree upon. I do think there are going to be some trade-offs in terms of as Larry's mentioned, the national missile defense. But frankly, my immediate concern is more the theater issues. My concern still is less the continental U.S. and more what might be a problem for our European allies and U.S. interests abroad. Let me leave it at that.
I see absolutely no reason not to build a multi-layered ballistic missile defense system as soon as possible. As a matter of fact, I can't imagine a coherent approach to the world that wouldn't want to do that. I mean, one of the chief threats, most urgent threats to the United States and to the homeland are rogue regimes which are trying to acquire nuclear missiles and to marry them to ICBM capabilities. There's a reason they're trying to get it. I'm not saying that they're planning first launches, but I am saying that they're intending to use those nuclear missiles to empower their conventional aggressions in the area. We're seeing what the North Koreans are doing. If Iran gets the missiles, it's going to be like North Korea on steroids. And a multi-layered ballistic missile defense system will give us a high confidence level that we can shoot down the missiles. We know we can hit a bullet with a bullet. And if you do that, the chain of reasoning behind wanting to get them in the first place falls apart. This, by the way, is an example of the connection, the sense in which defense policy is foreign policy. And I want to suggest to you that if we had been doing this, if we had been deploying faster than we were deploying and building a global missile defense system, not just emphasizing theater missile defense, and we had a good chance of getting that in place quickly, it would have empowered our efforts to dissuade the Iranians from trying to get the system. Because from their point of view, what's the point of getting the nuclear missiles if the United States will be able to shoot it down with a high confidence level? The whole chain of reasoning behind it falls apart. So it's an entirely non-nuclear conventional system. It's entirely defensive. You can't use it to attack anybody. And we know that the technology is there and that we can do it. I just don't see any, and the numbers, even in an era of austerity, aren't that great. I mean, the cuts that the president has put in place have been no more than several $1 billion a year. It's like if we restored the funding, we'd add $2 or $3 billion a year. It's worth doing. I think it may be the single most important defensive system that we have. And obviously, if you're going to have a strategic arsenal, it ought to be reliable. I agree with you. They need to fix it, and I would not be shrinking the arsenal. The agreement we reached, there's just no sign that it's had an impact on anybody else causing them to shrink their arsenals. They're all growing theirs.
I think there are just a couple of strategic questions to add. The real issue that we haven't talked about is the question of whether the military can do every job. And I think the answer to that is clearly no, the military can't do every job. But we need to understand what an effective, a well-financed, a leading, cutting-edge military does for us. It provides the deterrent. And at the end of the day, that is really what we're looking for. We're looking for a military that we invest in and technology that we invest in that causes people to think twice about what they're investing in so that we don't have to fight. It basically means unleveling the playing field. If we look right now at whether we are the leading edge internationally on military technology and on national defense, the answer to that, sadly, I think, is no. We have been historically at the front end of almost every important development, and we are no longer there. The example that I like to give is not in the nuclear area, but it is in the missile area, and that is precision-guided munitions. Okay, we used to be, most of you are probably too young to remember, but when we first went after Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War, I still remember, because I had it up on my fridge, a cartoon, and it showed a missile coming off of a ship and down and onto land and skimming across the earth and then going into a house, going up the stairs and going out the back window. And obviously, I don't think they do that. I don't know enough to say if they do. God, that'd be awesome, though. But that being said, that was amazing to people, okay? Now, Hezbollah has precision-guided munitions, not just state actors, but non-state actors, okay? If we don't continue down this road, and missile defense is very much a part of it, our deterrent power goes away, our leading-edge power goes away, and our allies are no longer able to count on us. And I think we need to recognize that, because what it means when our allies don't count on us is increased proliferation, not decreased.
Andrew, do we have a chance to respond
Yeah.
to some of
Sure,
this?
briefly.
I just, my concern is that Danielle, you talk about how investing in missile defense is going and weaponry is going to deter aggression against the United States. If you take a look at the type of conflicts that we face today, intrastate conflicts, regional conflicts that don't directly impact the safety of the United States, and terrorism. Senator Tallent's former Commission on Prevention of Weapons of Mass Destruction Terrorism. I don't think that calculus holds in terms of what sorts of forces, what sorts of equipment is needed to preserve our security in light of those threats. I mean, I'm more concerned about an advanced cruise missile that may have nuclear capability or, frankly, conventional capability. I'm more concerned about 3D printing and what that may hold for the future. These are new arms control regimes that are needed. These are new technologies we face. I just don't see this kind of state-on-state threat as the primary threat to the United States. I just don't think over-investing in those areas is what's going to make the nation safer.
Can I, go ahead.
Let's let Danny or Senator Talent respond.
There's a reason they're trying to get the nuclear missiles, Mark, because they believe it has utility to them. And you're just watch North Korea. As he has the nuclear missiles, he can engage in these provocative actions. He knows that whatever else the United States does, he's not going to end up in the spider hole, because before it comes to that, he has the weapon, right? So what happens if somebody miscalculates? I mean, he does something, the South Koreans do something back, he does something, and all of a sudden this spins out of control. And what happens if, because they're getting nuclear missiles, other countries, Japan decides, well, maybe we better protect ourselves since the United States isn't building a global missile defense system. Or the Iranians get the weapons, and then the Saudis decide they got to have it. I mean, Heritage has game theoried this. When you get a multilateral confrontation involving countries that all have nuclear missiles, some of them don't have good launch protocols, they don't talk to each other, the risk of even an accidental launch goes way up, and we can put a damper on that. Now, you're right, it's not going to take care of the suitcase bomb, it won't take care of the bioweapon, but I mean, it will take care of what I see as the major threat from rogue regimes today. Are you going to add anything?
Larry, you want to make a quick
Let me
point?
make
Quick
two
point.
points here. First of all, if somebody gets a nuclear weapon, you still have containment and deterrence, okay? They've got to know we've got 5,000, and so you say, well, they're crazy. Well, no, they're not. They're very calculating in terms of what they do, and it worked in the Cold War. The other is, and going back to the point that was made here about we need a unified national security budget. We spend more on missile defense than the entire Coast Guard. You think that somebody's going to shoot a weapon at you with a return address, knowing you can blow them off the face of the earth, or try and sneak it in? That's the Coast Guard's job. That's the problem that you have in terms of, making trade-offs. And one other thing about the Chinese, their budget is less than our U.S. Navy. They spend the same percentage on their personnel as we do. They spend less, okay, but they have a bigger force. And the other thing about the Chinese military buildup used to be, and I remember when I went over there in the 80s when we were trying to help them modernize to deal with the Soviet Union, those generals, they had all private businesses. They don't have that anymore, so the budget's gonna go up because they can't make that money on the side.
Listen, we don't know how much the Chinese are spending on their military. A couple years ago, they officially said they were spending $95 billion. The Pentagon estimated then it was $160 billion. We have no idea. We do know they are surging their strength, buying 5 or 6 submarines a year. They're buying carrier killer missiles. They're laying the hulls for a blue water navy. They're launching their first carrier. I mean, they're building a nuclear submarine base, and we know exactly why they're doing it because they're telling us. They're doing it to deny the United States access, first out to the first island chain, and then out to the second island chain, which includes Guam. This is what they're doing, and this is why they are doing it. Now, I don't think the Chinese are necessarily, need to be our enemies, but the point, and this is what Danny said, we have to deter them. This is what the American military has done since the end of World War II, really. The idea is to deter and conflict before it rises to the level of a war. I mean, 50% of the shipping of the world passes through the South China Sea, which they claim they own and control. And we have treaty obligations with Japan and the Philippines. They almost came to a shooting war with Japan. And we're cutting the Navy, pivoting to Asia, but cutting the Navy. I mean, this is like the 30s. Even in the 30s, they did appeasement, but they didn't cut their military.
All right,
And it's what we're doing.
Let me ask you to switch gears for a second. We talked about the need for America to be involved in the world. What should our principles of intervention be? And I'm thinking in particular in Syria, which is an incalculable mess, and probably an unfair question to put to anyone. But let's just address that in the next 5 minutes.
You hope.
That's right.
We're liable to give you more answer than you give us questions.
Where do you want us to start?
Let's start with Syria.
And you want me to?
Yeah,
where do you
please. I'm
want-
sorry. I'm sorry.
Which human do you want to start? Well, I think my views on Syria are pretty well known to people. I think we have a national interest there. I think we've had a national interest since the beginning. And we have a real problem because, A, if we didn't have a national interest, then the President of the United States shouldn't have said that President Assad needs to go. Having said that President Assad needs to go, as to a sentiment that I agree with, we proceeded to do very little to ensure that he went. What happened in the coming year and a half? Something that I think it should be familiar to a lot of people. Looks a little bit like what happened in Afghanistan during the 1980s. A war that we ultimately won, but sowed the seeds for future trouble. We have subcontracted the execution of the ouster of Bashar al-Assad to the Qataris and the Saudis. Let me tell you, we do not have the same taste in rebels as the Qataris and the Saudis. They have been arming and supporting and helping among the rebels groups most closely affiliated with Al-Qaeda and with Salafis. What does that mean? It means that among the rebels who were moderates and who were dominated by moderates at the outset, there is now an edge for the Al-Qaeda groups. So no matter what happens, no matter where we go, Syria is going to end up being rather a mess. Second point, the President of the United States said that the use or the movement of chemical weapons is a red line for him. We can parse all we want why he said it, it's irrelevant. At the end of the day, he said it. Now, like, what I've called a CSI investigator, he said, well, I'm a little bit concerned about the chain of custody and I want to investigate the whole thing. Now, what message does that send? it sends a message to Iran, it sends a message to North Korea, it sends a message to Al-Qaeda, and that is that we really don't have red lines. What we really have is sort of points that we make that are kind of convenient, that we're willing to repudiate when they're inconvenient. So that's a secondary strategic problem for the United States. We have a choice. We can't simply go back to status quo ante. And that, I think, is the reality that people sort of refuse to accept when they debate what's going on in Syria. We can't turn around and say, okay, I want Bashar al-Assad back, and I want the kind of evil stability that he imposed, because what we've got in that country is a civil war right now. And so we have an option of trying to manage a better outcome at this point or not manage a better outcome. Right now, what we're doing is not enough.
Why don't I ask reaction from the other side of the table, and in particular, how much does it matter if we don't have a national interest, let's say hypothetically, that the president puts down a marker that maybe he's not willing to have?
Yeah, two things. When you basically don't have a direct national interest, it becomes a war of choice. And then you have to do a cost-benefit analysis and see if the cost that you might have to pay outweigh the benefits, and how much are you willing to do if, everybody says, even the people who want us to get involved say no ground troops. Okay, what happens if the other things don't work? Are you then going to do it? And the other is I have to, when you talk about American credibility and so on and so forth, again, I worked 30 years ago, we had 241 Marines and soldiers and sailors killed in Beirut. President Reagan after that said, we will not leave. This happened in October. We had a report come out in December. We were out there by February. And he said, what about American credibility? Well, we won the Cold War, okay? And if you go back and you take a look, people said, and I remember, well, if you leave Vietnam, what signal is that going to send to the Soviets? We now know the Soviets wondered why we stayed so long. So I think this idea of credibility, people are going to look, you want to mess with the United States, this is what you're going to have to, deal with. So when people do that, I think you need to sit down and do a cost-benefit analysis. And my looking at it right now, I think the cost, unless you go in multilaterally and you get UN or at least NATO, support, far outweigh the benefits that you might get.
Yeah, 2 points. One of them is, Larry mentioned Reagan. I mean, Reagan used to say it's not strength that's provocative around the world, it's weakness. And so the whole rest of our forum, no matter what you do tactically, it has less chance of a success if you're also weakening yourself, and not just in the tools of hard power, military power, but also the tools of soft power. But let's look at the tools of hard power. And I have to address something Larry said in his opening remarks. He said that we're not cutting the defense budget, we're just slowing the growth rate, okay? Bob Gates, and the last time we did actual defense policy was when Bob Gates produced a set of budgets in the spring of 2011 after he'd cut, and that set of budgets projected modest nominal increases in the defense budget for 10 years out, about 2% a year, okay? They cut $1 trillion, including the sequester off of that. So at the current budget lines, we're going to spend in 2020 $100 billion less in nominal dollars than we spent in 2010. Nominal dollars. We are taking a nominal cut. In real dollars, of course, it's much.
Sequestration.
Well, sequestration is the law, Larry.
Oh, okay, fine, and that is a real cut.
Even
But you
even
mentioned,
without sequestration.
no, Senator,
well,
you mentioned in the beginning we had already cut. Okay, yes, sequestration is a real cut. The 480 was not a real cut.
The Budget Control Act number, if sequestration is repealed, they'll still have the Budget Control Act, which was passed in 2011.
Right.
And we'll be spending $50 billion less in nominal dollars in 2020 than we spent in 2010.
No, again, Bob Gates basically, if you take a look at the Bush budgets, when he projected leaving office, he said by 2010 it was going to be 534. Gates asked for 544. okay, in his last year. So a lot of this, arithmetic doesn't
We are
add up.
on a path, and this is the government's numbers, to spend in 2020 $100 billion less in nominal dollars than we spent in 2010. If the sequester is repealed, and nobody here is going to bet their own money that that's going to happen, repealed or replaced with anything else, because it doesn't look like it's going to, we'll be spending $50 billion less in nominal dollars. We're scheduled to spend about what we spent in 2004. Now, what would have happened to your purchasing power if you were earning this year what you were earning in nominal dollars in 2004, okay? So what we did was, we're taking a drawdown when we never had a buildup.
You
And
had a
that's the
buildup
difference
between
between
98 and
We
2004.
had a buildup in dollars, but we did not
In
get a
real terms,
buildup.
it went up between 98 and
Yes.
2004.
Larry, they spent more money, but they did, that's
I'm
true.
not counting the war
I'm not
funding,
denying,
okay?
now I'm talking about the year, in
All
the
right,
decade.
so-
I was there, we spent more money, but we did not get a bigger or a better equipped military.
right,
Because
so-
the money got eaten up in personnel costs, in maintenance costs, because when you use an old inventory more than you intended, maintenance goes up. Got eaten up in war costs.
No, the war costs were
All right,
separate. The
I've
war
almost
costs were
almost
separate.
completely lost control, but not quite. So, Mark,
All right, let me get that in before 1 o'clock.
Mark gets the last word on this issue, and then we do have just a few minutes left. I want to get through one more lightning round. So,
I'll
Mark,
end the budget debate with Syria. Put 500,000 troops into Syria with $500 billion plus. Yeah, that will throw the numbers out of whack. I mean, is that the type of national interest we're talking about for it? Because I think we have to remember what the true costs of going to war are, whether unilaterally or multilaterally.
I'm sorry, who suggested putting 500,000 troops in Syria?
How many troops do you think it would take to occupy Syria?
Who suggested occupying Syria?
Well, let's look at how we walk into it. First, we have to get over the fact that there is no right answer to this. No matter which direction we go, we will not be able to control, and it's not just a civil war, one side against the other. You are talking about multiple sides. Several weeks ago, it looked like the Free Syrian Army would fall. Now it looks like they're doing a little bit better. The Qataris have their goals. The Saudis have their goals. Assad has his goals. This is not something that we can manage. This is chaos over there. Now, do we have a responsibility or an obligation? Yes, and the first one is we cannot do any more harm. I am concerned, although I do favor the provision of lethal aid. I think there are enormous risks, and we have to understand what they are. And part of those are owning the conflict even more than we do now. I also think, so where do I think what we need to do? First, you need to manage by also getting the parties to the table. And we can, make as much fun of the efforts that have been done at the UN so far, but we have to continue those efforts. We have to continue to push on the Russians from all sides, and we have to get these parties to the table. What I think the best case is some sort of and Assad is going to be gone, whether he's going to be killed or whether or not the war is going to devolve into a situation where he has to get out. I think that what we have to do is start focusing on how to build the capacity of whatever this transition government may be, whatever the post-Assad regime may be, to actually govern. Otherwise, we see a situation where there is such a lack of regional stability, we find ourselves dragged into yet another major conflict in the Middle East. And I agree with Larry. Right now, this is by choice. But what if we get a situation where this expands throughout the region and it isn't by choice
Mark,
anymore?
and that's a very good point. We do have vital national interests in the region, and I don't know what to do about Syria. But really, the two of them are to make sure the terrorists don't get weapons of mass destruction to use against us. And the second is that the whole region doesn't become destabilized, including countries like Jordan, with whom we have a strong relationship and on whom we rely on, who are expecting us to try and help them. So it's a very difficult situation. But one thing, I wonder if we can all agree that at least a couple years ago, we should have been more, not aggressive is the wrong word, we should have used the proactive in at least using the tools of soft power more effectively than we did. State a vision for the region, identify the groups that wanted that vision, reach out to them, at least raise their prestige. I mean, we could have been doing that, and it surprised me, frankly, that I think the president, because of his enormous prestige abroad, would have been very effective had he done so. And that's really the big mistake. Arming people, I understand. There's a lot of pros and cons to that, but
so Well, I did lose control. Okay. I was sitting here struggling because it's 12:59, about a graceful way to bring this thing to a conclusion to make it look like I had control all along, but that's a forlorn hope, so I'm not even going to go there. And I'd be reticent to give anybody the last word because who knows? And we have a rule at Heritage, which is we always start late but end on time. So I would just, here's my one takeaway, because actually there were issues that we could have gotten into where there actually, I think, are very productive discussions. Everybody, I think, agrees manpower costs are spinning out of control regardless of what you want to do with the defense budget. There's some other things, and there's some clear issues of real differences, and Syria being a good case study of kind of what do we really want to use our military for, and what's the purpose of intervention. It's frustrating to me. These are questions about our future security that are well worth having and discussing, and they're not what everybody's talking about in Washington. And let's be honest, it's probably not likely, but it's to our detriment that these kinds of conversations aren't broader and more vociferous and more often. But I want to thank our panelists for more than exceeding the challenge to making this a stimulating hour. So thank you.